I like to say that because I think it's a good example for people, you know, that you can do something, you know, in the middle of your life, you can start doing something new. Oh, well, my first encounter was many years earlier because I read, well, first of all, I studied Latin for many years, but in school, but when I was in college, I read Dante in a parallel text edition. You know, I mean, I could sort of work out some of the Italian because I knew French and I knew Latin. But I really wanted to learn Italian because I wanted to read Dante in Italian. And then we had a class, so many years later after that, I mean, I always had that desire, but it wasn't until many years later that we had a class at the New Yorker. Actually, Marina Yare was the person who, I mean, she sort of was the facilitator in a sense, because she had just come back from Rome and she also wanted to learn Italian. So so we had a class and we studied Italian for a year, and then we actually read the Divine Comedy. We had a teacher, and we then read Dante. Yeah, our teacher was, there's a famous Dante professor at Columbia called Maristella Lorch, and it was her daughters who were our Italian teachers. So, I mean, one of them taught us the first year, and then the second daughter, Lavinia, read the Divine Comedy with us. Yeah, every week we read a canto of the Divine Comedy. Oh yeah, I mean, there's no question that well, first of all, knowing another language changes your perception of the languages that you already know. I mean, learning another language, and yeah, studying it, Italian certainly, you know, gave me a different appreciation of English, or different way of analyzing English. English gave me a way of analyzing Italian. I mean, you know, they work together, and there's no question that having another language is so useful for understanding your own language. Well, I memorized a lot of verbs. My learning process was a little bit unorthodox. I mean, we had this class, we studied grammar, and then I read a lot. Really, most of my Italian comes from reading. You know, I didn't really study. I mean, I'm not saying this is a good way to do it, but it's how I was able to do it. Was by reading. I mean, I took a couple of other classes, and that class, the New Yorker Italian class, continued, although it was more of a conversation class, than a grammar class. But yeah, I mean, I guess it was just mostly from reading, some studying, some things that I already knew. I never lived in Italy, which is unfortunate. So it means that I don't have a good, you know, my daily life Italian isn't so good. But of course, you know, spending time, I mean, I spent like a couple of months at a time there. And I've been going, you know, 2 or 3 times, especially since I left my job, I've been going 2 or 3 times a year. I used to go at least once a year, and now I've been going 2 or 3 times a year. But of course, this year I'm not going at all. I love Rome particularly, but I've been to a lot of other places, but not nearly as many places as I would like to go. I almost never do. Well, usually there's not time. I mean, it seems a little counterintuitive, but there are, you know, most publishers will have a deadline for when they want the translation. Usually, I mean, I try to read the book first, but I don't necessarily even read the book first. I just start typing. So I do a very rough first draft, usually. I mean, always. And I do the whole book. I don't work in sections. I translate the whole book first, because, you know, you don't know what's coming. You need, I mean, I guess if I read it first, I wouldn't necessarily do that, but anyway, for me, that's the best way to do it, is to do a very rough draft. I mean, I look up the words. I look up many words. I look up words that I know perfectly well, because you just never know what there might be lurking behind there. And then in the subsequent drafts, I just keep refining it. I mean, the second draft, I usually try to make all the major changes. I mean, fix the major difficulties, because in the first draft, you begin to recognize what the problems are going to be, or some of the problems, or you know where those sentences are that those tricky sentences are. And then the second draft, I try to resolve as many of those things as possible. And then after that draft, or maybe after the third draft, I always print it out and I read on paper, which is, I think, crucial, because I think you just see so many things on paper. You probably know this, that you don't necessarily see on the computer. So then I just keep going over it and over it until the deadline approaches. I think I use the same approach no matter who the writers, if it's an unfamiliar or a familiar writer. I mean, these days you can look anybody up on the internet. You can find out a little bit about the writer. Actually, I just translated a book, a very strange book, by this guy, you might know him, called, what's his name? Massimo Recalcati. He's a psychoanalyst, and he's a Lacanian psychoanalyst. But in addition to writing books, he gives these talks. So I was able to see some of his talks on the internet, which was incredibly helpful. But yeah, I mean, it's a good example, because when I started, just sort of casually looking at, to see what else he'd written and this or that, and then I saw that he was like, the rock star psychoanalyst. Well, the first one I read was the Days of Abandonment. I translated the first 3 short novels before the Neapolitan Quartet. And, I immediately, like many people, I was just totally gripped by her. The Days of Abandonment was like, I barely could stop reading it. I think I read the whole book before I started working on it. Except for the sample translation that I did. But that was, but she's such a, she just, even on a superficial level, she's such a gripping writer. I mean, just on the level of the story, what's going to happen next? What are these people going to, what are these people going to do now? So it's, it's sort of like the first draft isn't that hard, because because if you haven't, especially if you haven't read the book, you just want to know what happened, what's going to happen, what's she going to do now? There was, I mean, I knew she was anonymous. I guess I knew or at some point I found out she was anonymous. I guess I must have known that from the beginning. And that you couldn't, there wasn't a way to ask her questions directly or work with her. But, I really hardly ever worked with any of the writers. And I've translated a lot of dead writers. So an absent writer was not that unusual for me or that difficult. I have some questions, and I ask the editors, and they ask her, and then they tell me. So we have this kind of 3-way system, which is, it works fine. It's sort of inexplicable in some ways, but in other ways, I think that although she writes about a very particular place and time, the characters, I mean, they sort of have relationships that we can all recognize. I mean, even if you don't necessarily, let's say, identify with them, you recognize them. I mean, we all have mothers and fathers or some version of that, friends, partners, it's siblings. So there's a lot that's familiar. I mean, it's not even familiar, but you recognize the basic outlines and the emotions. And I think she just manages somehow to take you to another place in those relationships that you might not necessarily want to go, but you're compelled. It's very intense, and it really, I mean, it's the sentences as much as anything that pull you along. I mean, it's the plot, of course, but it's also, you know, I think the way she constructs her sentences or her writing, that also is, it's very, I don't know, people have been saying propulsive, but I think that's true. Well, I don't know. I mean, you could say it's compelling, but that doesn't really, I don't know if that's really a word about style. I mean, her style, it's dense. It's not, you know, it's not small sentences. It's quite dense, but it seems to me that it's dense with a purpose. She wants to get somewhere, you know, she's like trying to get to the truth of something. And so she's like, you know, digging, maybe digging is a good word. She seems to be digging into an emotion, let's say, or even something that's happening, you know, sort of digging into it to see what's behind, what the truth of it is. I don't know, something like that. I had been to Naples actually like in the late 80s and early 90s. And then I didn't go to Naples while I was working on the novels, which is, I was sorry about, you know, I would have liked to. And then I did go afterwards. So it was kind of crazy. I mean, and since then I've been like 3 times. Well, I think reading is really the best way. I mean, conversation also. I mean, I guess, you know, being in America is probably, it's like for me, being in Rome is really useful. It's really wonderful, or being anywhere in Italy is great. But I really think reading is so helpful. You know, and reading a variety of authors. One of the things that I read a lot when I was learning Italian, I used to read mysteries a lot, because the language isn't that difficult, and because the main point of them is the plot, it's easy to keep reading. You don't get discouraged. You don't even have to look up all the words. One American writer writing now, who I think is a really great writer, is Vivian Gornick. I mean, in terms of, you know, I happen to love Anthony Trollope, for example. He's also, I think, he's a 19th century novelist. Okay. Also really great. I mean, he wrote these this series of political novels, which are pretty interesting to read. I mean, they're all, you know, they all have lots of funny characters. Another more modern novelist who I think is a really wonderful writer is Shirley Hazard. She hasn't written a lot, but I mean, she died a couple of years ago. Well, I just read or reread one called The Bay of Naples. There's one, her most famous novel is called The Transit of Venus. Well, I have one translation, another translation that just came out is Farewell Ghosts by Nadia Terranova, which I really thought was a wonderful book. And I'm working on this writer called, I don't know if you've ever heard of her, called Marina Yare. She's from the north. I mean, she's from Turin. She lived in Turin, but her father was Latvian. Okay. And her mother was Valdese. Anyway, she's an interesting writer. I think they're sort of trying to bring her back. She also died just a few years ago.